Can it support the idea that it creates? And I'm skeptical, very skeptical about that.
Can evolution support the idea that it has the capabilities to create in the sense of origins? And also, do the accounts that we see within the book of Genesis contradict themselves? Let's go ahead and get into the mind of John Lennox, who is a Christian apologist and mathematician.
The creation story in Genesis gets the order of events mixed up a bit. How could God have allowed this if it was always going to be scrutinized when science got there? It should be perfect. And then after that, please can you give us your opinion as a mathematician on the role of probability in the theory of evolution? We're told that random chance has played a large part in the natural selection of genes. But how likely is this in your view?
How many hours have you got? Well, let's be brief and just approach this. You see, the assertion is that Genesis gets it mixed up. There's a book called The Genesis Enigma. It's written by a non-theist who is one of the highest placed scientists in our country, who happens to be a friend of mine. And he was giving a talk on bioluminescence in front of a group of journalists who said, "You sound like Genesis." And he thought Genesis was a pop group or something. "What do you mean, Genesis?" They said, "Genesis in the Bible." And he was curious about this. So he went and got a Bible and started reading page 1. And then he read it again. And the result was a book called The Genesis Enigma. He said, "From what I know of science, this is so accurate that what I do not understand is how they knew. And if ever," and I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember the exact quote, "if ever there was a page of literature that would convince me that there is a God, it would be that." Now, what the questioner is probably referring to is that the order of events in Genesis 1 appears on the surface to be different from the order of events as recorded in Genesis 2. But it seems to me that that is very easily understood by remembering that there are different kinds of order. There is chronological order, and Genesis 1 certainly gives an impression of being chronological. There is a sequence. But then there's logical order. For instance, if I'm talking to an architect and builder about a hospital in Birmingham, and I say, "Tell me about the hospital." Well, first we dug a big hole in the ground, and then we put in various basic steel girders that reached to the roof, and then we built a car park, and then we built administration offices, and then we built a ward, and then we built operating theatres above that, and then we built more wards above that, and then the air conditioning and the roof. That's a chronological description. But if I ask the head surgeon of the hospital, "Tell me about your hospital," he's likely to say something like this: "Well, this hospital is very convenient because, you see, in the middle we put the operating theatres, and above them and below them we put the wards, and then of course there's the admin, the car park, and so on." When you hear that description, do you imagine that suddenly the operating theatres appeared in the sky above? Of course you don't. Because you know intuitively how to separate logical order and chronological order. Well, if we do that in our everyday language, surely we're grown up to allow it in the Bible. A lot of the confusions with the Bible are applying to it canons of grammar that we wouldn't apply to any other book. Now, that's a huge topic. And I'm going to do another bit of shameless advertising.
You go for it.
Because I get this kind of question about Genesis so often that I've written a little book about it called 7 Days That Divide the World. The second question was about evolution. I'm not a biologist, although I'm fascinated by biology. And the question is limited to the role of probability, meaning presumably chance, in evolution. Now, of course, you have to step back from this. What is evolution and what does it do? And I'm a mathematical skeptic here. I must confess that straight away. But clearly, Mutation and natural selection do something. Just have a look around this room. Why do we all not look the same? Well, thankfully we don't. But the reason is that there has been selecting. I selected my wife, or at least I think I did. She probably selected me 50 years ago. And that's why our children look as they do. It was selection of a very real type. And most of us are afflicted, I say it that way because they're mostly deleterious, with mutations of which we might eventually die. So natural selection and mutation do something. And clearly there is, from the perspective of analysis, there is a random element in it. I don't find that difficult. And certainly, since we're all different, and I believe that God is behind it, God is behind that. The bigger question is whether the neo-Darwinian theory or its modifications today can support the weight that is put on it. That is, can it support the idea that it creates? And I'm skeptical, very skeptical about that. I don't see the evidence, but the one point I would make about it, ladies and gentlemen, is the greatest confusion comes in the failure to distinguish evolution, whatever it does or doesn't do, and the origin of life. The one thing evolution clearly didn't do was produce life, even though Dawkins has been saying for years that it did. Why? Because evolution, whatever it does or doesn't do, can only operate when life already exists, so it cannot be used to account for life. Now that's a huge topic, and I'm not going to say I've written a book on it, even though I have.
Now, John Lennox makes it very clear that he is not a biologist, but one thing that he is a mathematician. And what mathematicians love to do is calculate and look at probabilities. So let me give you a quick example of what happens when a mathematician and a microbiologist come together and form a set of probabilities as it relates and pertains to the efficacy of natural selection or evolution to be able to occur by chance. So a man named Michael Denton, who was a microbiologist, he came together and formulated a mathematical equation with another gentleman as it relates and pertains to cell replication. And I'm going to make this really fast and simple. For instance, they used a small protein fold, and what a protein fold has within it is the building blocks of life, which is amino acids. So they took a chain of amino acids that build a protein, and within this chain you have different sequence spaces. They used a small chain of 150 sequence spaces. So it looks like you can have one amino acid here, one amino acid here in the second sequence, and the third sequence, another amino acid, all the way up to 150. But what's important to notice is that in each sequence space, you can only have 1 out of 20 amino acids that fit within one sequence. And in the second sequence, you can only have 1 out of 20. And in the second sequence, you can only have 1 out of 20. And what this looks like is each amino acid that is selected and picked, it has to work with whatever other amino acids are picked within that chain, or else it creates something called a non-functional cell. It will not replicate, it will degrade. So speaking about probability, and again, I'm going to reiterate one more time that it has to work in accordance to the other amino acids that are selected, or else it will not work, which means this shows that there has to be something guiding it, because probability and chance does not best explain on a philosophical level of reasoning why we get functional protein replication in this cell. So back to the sequences, and I'm almost done. First sequence, you have 1 out of 20, okay? What's the probability of that? 1 out of 20. What about the second sequence? Now that you have this sequence and this sequence to account for, that would be 20 to the second power, which means you have 400 different possibilities of just the first and the second sequences working in accordance to another. Now let's go to the third. That would be 20 to the third power, which that number now grows to 8,000. So within just the first 1, 2, and 3 sequences, you already have within those 3 sequences, you have 8,000 different ways that those amino acids could be selected and picked to work. and probabilistic measures show that that does not make sense. And what this means is that there are more ways to create and develop a non-functional cell to replicate, which would degrade it, than there are ways to develop a functional cell that would replicate and produce life. And what this shows is that God has become intimate with his creation, and he has developed it in a pattern that we can recognize that there is divine guidance at work within certain things that we see. And pertaining to origins, as Dawkins says, he can accept that the first thing that happened in the creation of the universe was that it happened by chance. I'm sorry, but that doesn't make sense. And I'm calling that the atheism of the gaps. You don't know, so you put something as irrational on that being the creation of the universe, and say it was by chance. We can do better than that. With that being said, I hope you have a blessed day. Put your trust, confidence in Jesus Christ. He loves you. He is the way, the truth, and the life. Be blessed.